I am happy to introduce the next speaker, Professor Bart Preneel. He is a professor at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Now I should put on my glasses. A very well-known cryptographer, served as president of the IACR, that's the International Association of Cryptologic Research, and he's also a fellow of the IACR. He does not only does research and teach, but also does consultancy for industry and government, and he is engaged very much in cybersecurity policy, for example, in the European Union. Also at ENISA as an advisory group member. So we are really very happy to have you here, Bart. And the title of the talk is The Many Faces of the Crypto Wars.
Good afternoon, it's great to be back. Very difficult challenge to give a talk after lunch. Actually, I was at one of the first editions of this conference. I always enjoy it very much. So since it's an after lunch talk, it will not be about technology, but about policy, so lightweight. So I gave ChatGPT my title, or developed me, and this is what we use. So you see, if you use the word crypto in something, then it actually uses Bitcoin symbols. But crypto is creating a problem, and it's not cryptocurrency, it's cryptography. And this problem came with the massification of cryptography. So when I started in the field, actually in 1987, there were very few crypto devices around, probably a few 100,000 at most for the military and the government. And then we got cryptography in software around the 1990s, RC4, MD5, these are the things where crypto became fast in software. We got CSAM, and so after the interception of Prince Charles, it was realized we had to encrypt our wireless communications. We got PGP being spread as software, and we got SSL to protect credit card numbers. So cryptography became a mass product, and so created tensions between government, civil society, and scientists about who should control technology and whether technology should be allowed for usage. You heard a talk this morning about Snowden. Post-Snowden, I think some very big development in the creation of Let's Encrypt to actually make SSL widely used. It's actually amazing that before Snowden, there were like only 10 million secure web servers. And Let's Encrypt has changed this. A large part of traffic is now encrypted, and is now more than 100 million servers. But I want to go back because people talk about crypto wars, they talk about the early 90s, but in fact there was an early crypto war, and I'm following you the numbers of Susan Landau. So in fact already in the 70s there was a problem because some research in the US were working on cryptography, and they got a letter from some over-enthusiastic too efficient bureaucrats, probably from the NSA or DOD, that told them, should you really publish this kind of thing? And so in fact, even today, there is a regime where in the US researchers are requested to send their papers to the NSA before publishing them. But there is no control, but at some moment there was control, and there was a suggestion to do this. What may be less known is we have something similar in Europe. So when I started, in fact, I was funded by the National Science Foundation, but my colleague was funded by a project, a European project. It was submitted, and the coordinator was David Schaum. It was a very Netherlands-focused project because there was also Philips Crypto, Kees Janssen, and Gert Rolofsen, KPN. And then there was Siemens, Argus, and Leuven. The proposal was submitted to create kind of a crypto competition. Olympic game for cryptographers, more or less, like we've seen in the NIST competitions. And this project got very high ratings, but it was stopped by the Secret Services because they didn't want actually academics and industry to work on cryptography. And so my bosses at the time, the professors, had to go to meetings in Brussels with guys with long raincoats and black cars. And there were lots of meetings and fights, and in the end the discussion was, you can have your project, but only when you do only authentication. This is how the project was called RIPE. RACE was the bigger program, Integrity Primitives Evaluation. So only integrity, we could not work on confidentiality. And I still remember that, by the way, if you know RIPE-MD, in fact, that comes from the RIPE project. So, and RIPE-MD 160 was later used in Bitcoin. And then as a postdoc, I went to deliver the final report in Brussels to the commission, and there was a person there sent by GCHQ to control cryptography research in Europe. His name is David H. If you want to know the full name, talk to me in the break. And more or less, he told me Europe will never fund again cryptography research. And indeed, afterwards, there was a regime. If you submitted a new proposal, which had cryptography in it, it was put in the trash. How do I know? Because I was in this meeting, I was sent by Belgium. Of course, I didn't put pros in the trash, but what happened before France, Netherlands, UK, and Germany met, they decided which proposals to kill, and then the next day in the official meeting, by accident, those proposals ended up in the hands of one of those 4 people, and they decided to kill the proposal. So, interestingly, in '99, the climate had changed a bit, and I submitted a new proposal for a new competition, and I thought it was a project I would never see, so I called it Nessie. But I was wrong, because in '99, actually, the project got funded. And so there was actually the first crypto war in trying to control research and trying to control funding. And there is still some of this. For example, you will see very few researchers in the US doing cryptanalysis with government funding. So the second crypto war is more responsive development of the deployment of encryption. So AT&T wanted to put out a chip on the market that would have allow businessmen to encrypt their communications with triple DES. And then, of course, we know what happened. The NSA proposed the Clipper chip. And academics and industry responded very negatively for many reasons. There was the first Kiosco debate. So the idea was the government would propose a chip which has secure encryption, but then the government would have a copy of the keys and would be able to read communication if needed. But of course, would never scale outside the US. It turns out the proposal also had technical flaws. So we were very proud that the Clipper chip was sunk. So we thought we won the crypto war, and that was it. And of course, less was true. Of course, the Communication Systems for Law Enforcement Act was voted the year later, which actually expanded access to encryption. Later on, metadata was collected also in the US. Was extended to voice over encryption also in Europe. The governments realized that they forgot to add interception to GSM communication. Of course, GSM is so insecure, we don't need interception capabilities. But so from 3G on, this oversight was removed, and to the amazement of the Americans, actually 3G, 4G, 5G all has intercept capabilities because this is what was decided more or less right after the crypto wars. And then, of course, in Europe, we look with amazement at the Snowden revelations, and apparently the Americans were very upset because actually the Snowden revelation showed that also metadata about Americans was collected. And this is really what made them upset, because in fact, the US, most Americans believe that human rights are only applicable to Americans. This is something that is very hard for non-Americans to grasp, but they don't believe actually that you have protections or any human rights because you're not an American. The only time you have protections is when you're on US soil, but not outside. But so Europe looked at this and said, oh, this is terrible. But in fact, we have our parliament voted the Data Retention Directive. And so metadata has to be collected at large scale. The European Court of Justice keeps destroying this, and the member states keep voting new implementations of this, which are clearly not in line with the protection against mass surveillance. But the end of the story is, in spite of all the legal fights, there is still massive data collection, of metadata collection in Europe. And then the third crypto war came. This is the Apple versus IBM case. This happened in 2015, but there were already debates before. So Mueller, who later became famous for other things, at that time was director of FBI, and he already pointed out in 2013 that there was too much encryption being used. So I guess this is in part a response to the Snowden revelation, he started encrypting more. And then the FBI now started complaining. And then Comey, actually, he used the phrase going dark, which is pretty interesting because, in fact, now At the European level, there is a working group, and the working group has been created last year. It's called the Going Dark Working Group. So we're always a bit delayed in Europe. We now also have one, and these ministers of justice, interior, and organizations like Europol trying to actually combat encryption. And so they claim more or less that they can't do their job because there is too much encryption and too much protection. There is always very little hard evidence for this. My point is that they have much more data than they ever had. There is now cameras everywhere. As you heard this morning, there is facial recognition. This is allowed to be used by police. Our cars collect all our data. It's kind of, there's lots of data for the police, they just don't have time to process it. And so they keep claiming that they don't have enough data, which is a bit of a mystery. Everyone actually kind of also made a statement, this is all before the FBI Apple case, more or less, which he asked aloud whether people should be allowed to have curtains or not. And he wasn't sure. And the government, of course, also heard the other side. The big tech actually was defending encryption. And strange enough, the other people defending encryption actually are the former NSA and DHS directors. It's actually very interesting that they say that encryption is essential. And in fact, we need encryption. In fact, they say the same thing as the academics and the NGOs. Society needs encryption. Of course, we know from the loan documents also that they say this because they have so many ways to go around it that they actually don't care when we use it. But on the other hand, I think they also reflect fairly that it really doesn't make sense to have your critical infrastructure vulnerable and your business is vulnerable, that actually this will harm your society in the long run. The Demi famous case came. I guess you all know the details of this. There was a really bad guy, killed a bunch of people and injured some others. And then they found his iPhone 5C. Interesting case, because he had other devices and he destroyed all of them. By the way, he could also kill, so there was no privacy issues in the sense that apparently once you die, you lose your privacy rights. But there was still his government device because he was also a government employee. Nobody actually focused on this version of the story. He was a government employee and he had a government issued iPhone 5C. And so the FBI went to Apple and said, we want to see what is on there. And so Apple, the FBI found a law from 1789 about iPhones. It more or less says that you have to do what you can to get access. It's called an all-writs order, which is everything to do in your means to give us access. And of course, Apple said, no, we can't do this. Any iPhone users here in the room? Feels good, huh? Apple protects you against the FBI. Well, I have bad news. Apple gives only data to the NSA, but that's a different story. And so, of course, the argument Apple used, I can summarize it very quickly, is that if we give it to the FBI, there will all the others coming there as well, other nation states, other police forces. And in fact, this, of course, was clearly a terrorist, but there will all be many cases where this debate is not as clear at all. We should actually give access to this. Story ended quickly. The FBI dropped the lawsuit very quickly, within a few months. They actually never pushed through. They chose their case carefully, but then they abandoned it. And they decided to pay $900,000 to bring it to an Israeli company that actually gave them access to the phone, and there was nothing on there. And then the more funny part is that Kodobogatov in Cambridge managed to do the same thing for $100, so the FBI overpaid it. But okay, small detail. So that but actually ignited the debate, and so very interesting in the Netherlands, actually, the message 2016 was no backdoor in encryption. Also, the Commission actually chooses this. This is still the official position of Europe, no backdoor in encryption. It's very interesting. Every time you Google the statement, you get advertisement of Huawei. I don't know why, but this is what happens. You can try it for yourself. France and Germany, on the other hand, they push for limits. So this is now all 8 years ago. The most interesting one is Australia. The laws of mathematics do not apply in Australia. This is what their prime minister said, which I think opens careers for mathematicians. Go there, there is much more creativity in mathematics, and you don't have to deal with all these rules of mathematics. There's much more freedom there. The US kept coming back, and so they keep saying, 2017, that one, proof encryption defeats the constitutional balance by elevating privacy above public safety, more or less. And somebody else said, if we can build autonomous cars, we can also build encryption with government access. We still can't build autonomous cars, but we still can't build encryption with government access. So need responsible encryption, suggesting that everything we have today is irresponsible. Very interesting way of talking. Maybe the other thing, which is not part of the war, but shows you what happens on the ground. We got 2020 and 2021, and apparently was also a case in 2023. We got a couple of cases where criminals were using hardened phones with dedicated encryption, and every time the police managed to actually hack the server and break the encryption. Also, the lesson for criminals is that if you actually start buying phones that cost several thousand euro with a subscription of 500 to 1,500 euro per month, the usage of this phone makes you very suspicious. So even if it's very secure, which they're not in the end, this is probably not the solution either. But of course, I think some politicians have been inspired by this, by believing that if you can break encryption, you can actually find criminals. Because indeed, 99.9% of those phone users were really criminals. But of course, that's not what the average case is. I will not repeat the whole debate, but there was already a first paper against CSGO in the 90s after the first or second crypto war, the Clipper chip incident, and then the Apple versus FBI actually inspired the same scientists to write the keys on the doormats, kind of an update to this, more or less saying that, well, we need encryption, the state of security and privacy is not so good. We're going to make the system more complex, less secure. This backdoor will be abused by bad actors. And there is a famous example of Juniper where there was a backdoor in the random number generator, the famous UOC, and then at some stage, this backdoor was replaced by another backdoor, and then it was put back. And what keeps baffling me is that nobody actually made any statement about this. Scientists wrote papers, but people keep buying Juniper routers. Although, like we see, this backdoor is in there, and the backdoor is being put back even after they've been detected, and seeing that you're taken over by other nations, and then you put it back, and we just move on with life as if nothing happens. There's other more technical arguments, and I think also Jaap-Henk wrote a blog post about it, and they can say more about this. Also interesting was that a few technical proposals were made after the Apple versus FBI, but very few of those actually stand up and have details. So already in 1997, we had this partial key as code, this idea of giving up only part of the key, and this was kind of revived in 2018. Ray Ozzie kept touting he had a solution, and in the end he gave some talks, but a lot of criticism during his talks. Stephen Lay wrote an article, but we've never heard of the proposal since. The most interesting scientific paper, I think, is the one at CCS by Stephen Savage. He actually tried to work out a solution for the FBI versus Apple setting. He tried to do this. And then Ernie Brigham also has been going around announcing a detailed solution for all these problems, but I still haven't seen the details. I mean, he announces the details, he has some ideas, but we never get to see the details. And the devil here is in the details, of course. And there is also somebody else who kept making announcements and never putting proposals forward. So somehow there seems to be not enough research, or it seems to be hard to do research. And what I sometimes hear, if you're active in crypto policy, is, well, there is no solution because you academics don't try hard enough. Now, the problem is you can never prove that you didn't try, that you tried hard enough. Try to prove that to somebody. I tried hard enough. No, that's something you can never do. And then so we got the fourth crypto war. We thought we were done, but that was the CSAM debate. Already Patrick Breyer spoke about this, and Jaap-Henk will speak about it in the next slot, so I can be very brief about this. More or less, it's unclear about what was inspired. I think on the one hand, it seems to be drive from law enforcement and the going dark story, that they claim that they can't do their job. The one event that triggered it is actually also was already mentioned by Patrick Breyer. So at this moment, we have the e-privacy directive, and already for more than a decade, the Commission tries to update this into a regulation, but they fail because there is no consensus. And there is a temporary exception that allows you to scan for CSAM. And this is being done, and by the way, this exception has been approved again for 2 or 3 more years last February. But this exception allows Meta to scan in your messenger for non-CSAM. And what happened is that Meta announced a few years ago that they were going to add end-to-end encryption to Messenger, which means that the scanning would stop. Now, it still baffles me why this can trigger a policy, because any pedophile with some brain has switched to WhatsApp, which is end-to-end encrypted, comes from the same company, and that cannot be scanned. Right? So it's kind of, you wonder, like, how serious cases can you detect by idiots who don't know that you should not use Messenger but WhatsApp if you don't want to be detected? But that was enough to kind of trigger policy change and a whole debate. I'm sure that Jaap-Henk will tell you much more about this. So if you want to wrap up the whole discussion, this debate will not go away, and this is also a motivated title. So some people say there were 3 wars, there were 4 wars. I think we'll see wars forever because it's a very complex debate. And also, there is many forms of access. So the Clipper chip was very clear. It was about access to voice communication on top of the slide. And then later, and there was a debate about it, and in the end it was decided not to give it. But then VoIP came. And for example, for VoIP, again, interception capabilities were added. I don't know whether some of you remember this, but actually there was a breakthrough with a peer-to-peer communication system that allowed you for encrypted communication called Skype. And Skype was amazing because it broke the firewalls, both telcos and companies, so you could actually use it because there was anybody could do VoIP, but it was blocked everywhere. But Skype managed to escape this and have end-to-end encryption. It was a European company. And I guess you all know what happened to Skype. It was acquired by Microsoft, and within a month, this peer-to-peer architecture was replaced by a central architecture. And there's some very interesting Snowden documents that actually show that the NSA solved the problem, because if you ever use Skype on multiple devices, Skype had a synchronization problem, so messages kept popping up. And the NSA showed how they had a tool, how to unify those messages again so they don't have to look at them many times. Right? It was actually a leaked document that shows exactly how Skype interception was made more convenient. Okay, so that's actually what happened there. Communication data, of course, use messages. Your SMSs are not encrypted. Metadata is very valuable, and we discussed it already, so this is definitely highly important. It doesn't mean only who's communicating to whom, but also with your phone where you are, and also which app you're using, and so on. So in fact, it's extremely valuable information. Then if you go to store data, this is also some scenario that happens once in a while, that they don't come to me anymore, but like until 10 years ago, the Belgian police came with a hard disk and said, we think this is the hard disk of a pedophile, can you please decrypt? And so this is another problem, which I think doesn't need to mass surveillance, because you need to have the hard disk in your possession, and then we had to run FPGAs, and sometimes we succeeded, and sometimes we didn't. And then they said, you didn't try hard enough. I said, well, I can't prove that. I can't prove I tried hard enough, but okay. So that's a very different case again. But of course, the really interesting debate is devices, and you can classify the FBI Apple case as a confiscated device. This is a device in the hands of the police. I think it's probably the only case that can be solved, maybe without creating mass surveillance. And also the same thing with stored data, right? Not in the cloud, but if you really have to have the hard disk in your possession, then you can have a solution, or imagine a solution where there is no mass surveillance. But of course, I'll come back to this, but today the state of the art is remote. Actually, police forces want access like they get in SkyECC and EncroChat. So in SkyECC, what they could see was in real time criminals ordering murders, criminals showing how they tortured somebody else, and so on. Police could all follow this in real time. In fact, it's also not good because apparently they're not allowed to watch this, in the sense that if they see this, they have to intervene, which of course then breaks their cover, and then criminals stop using these phones. But so the point is we do more and more things online, we have complex interactions, and the police always want those things. And if they want something, the problem, and of course the latest problem is CSAM, but they have many problems, and then they more or less use an argument to get access to everything. They never come with a detailed, I've never seen such a slide by police forces who show exactly what the problems are for which cases, and they just say encryption is bad and we want access to everything. That's more or less the summary of the kind of arguments you get out of them. And this is very hard to debate this, and I'm sometimes wondering whether, in fact, it's not a fake debate and they want to hide the real debate. We heard about Snowden already, so of course, there doesn't seem to be such a big problem with encryption because the NSA still can have access to what they want, and they had many ways of breaking encryption. I do want to acknowledge, of course, that the NSA has more powers than the average police force, and certainly the local police force. So I'm not saying it's the same and there is no difference. But of course, the most important part of this sentence, collect it all, know it all, exploit it all. Exploiting doesn't mean here the information, but exploiting means hacking the systems. And that is, of course, also what is happening. Anybody heard of Hacking Team? It's amazing. So Hacking Team is an Italian company that sells hacking tools to police forces and also to governments. And Hacking Team has also as customers non-democratic regimes. Also the police forces, by the way, of UCSB, so where crypto is being held. So it's quite likely if you attend crypto that one of the tools is used against your devices. But Hacking Team is very interesting because they were hacked. And so if you go to Wikipedia, you'll find the links. So 47 gigabytes of data was hacked, including all their tools and all their customer lists. And so this is how you get an idea what kind of things are being done. And Hacking Team was an Italian company. Their slogan was, we believe that fighting crime should be easy. There is only one kind of state where fighting crime is easy. We call it a police state. But so Hacking Team actually helps creating a police state. And this is under auspices of the Italian government. And then you can go look at Wikipedia and look at the list of their customers. It's pretty shocking. Of course, now since then we have seen more of those incidents. There is NSO Group, there is Celebrite, there is all these tools that now got to publicity. The really bad guys are now NSO Group. Why? Because they were caught. That's the problem. So now they're actually in a bad corner because they were caught. But in fact, there is hundreds of those companies, and they all get money from governments to exactly do what NSO Group does. Of course, NSO Group made another few PR mistakes. They first said their systems could not be used in the US and Israel, which turned out not to be true. And then they said that they actually checked this, and then later on it was leaked that Netanyahu himself was a target of Pegasus, which probably your prime minister doesn't like that if you hear these kind of things. So they come kind of got now, they get bad press everywhere, but they're now just replaced by some other company. So our governments actually have hundreds of those companies which they give money, because not everybody has the budget of the NSA and the CIA and GCHQ to write those tools. So you just pay companies to do this. And if they do bad things, you actually badmouth them and put them on a blacklist. And you even threaten to prosecute the CEO, and then you go move on with the next company. That's more or less, I think, where the state of the art is. So there is lots of access. And of course, the argument is terrorists and organized crime. Now we also have all the cyber war, which is an excuse. You know, the other guys does it too. So now we have to have it too. But we know that those tools are very hard to control. And in the end, they will be used also against politicians, against journalists, against human rights activists. That's more or less the state of the art. And so sometimes in my most depressive evenings, I'm thinking like, maybe all these crypto fights are just there so we don't talk about this. Because in fact, this is where the real problem is. Because all the other things are schemes under public control, and you can debate it, you can write letters about it, but this is all happening, it's continuously happening, there is always new companies, they do new stuff, and I don't think we can build systems without zero days. So this is probably where the real debate should be, and so my concern is that we have all these crypto wars, while in the back justice is happening. And we actually, as academics, we're giving talks, and we focus on all the other things, but not on the real problem, which is all this. So I think it's also clear that you cannot ban this. Right? You just need 5, 10, maybe 20 bright people, and they may exist in police services, they may exist in the military, they may exist in a government, in a private company, and you'd need very small budgets to have actually enormous impact. So my question is always, who is going to watch over this? Because I think trying to ban this, there's going to be nice statements, you will not do this, and whatever, and in Europe it doesn't happen, and you read the Pegasus report, I recommend reading it, it's with the parliament, where it's how being used in Catalonia against Catalonian politicians, as it was used in Poland, it was used in Hungary, and it's just those who are caught again. It's probably used in every country, but maybe not in all countries against human rights activists or opposition, but it's used everywhere. So I think we should, as a society and as scientists, ask the question, can we somehow control this? I think if you have such a tool, you should have a camera in your office and a log of your screen and everything you do the whole time. That's the only way I can actually accept that somebody would have such a tool. Have extreme supervision. The problem, of course, is that we do have supervision. Like in Belgium, these are very wise people. They're retired judges. And last time I saw them, none of them used a computer, ever in their lives. That's the reality. And they're very wise people, they're very smart, and they're experienced in deciding complex legal issues, but they don't have technical skills. And they don't have a technical team to help them to make this. Okay, so that was the kind of history of the crypto war. So I spend most of my free time, the time I'm not doing things the university pays me for, like teaching and supervising PhD students. I spent last year on a lot of policy debates and writing letters. And one was the CSAM, but Jaap-Henk will speak about this. So I also was one of the authors of the second impact assessment requested by the European Parliament. But we also wrote other letters. One about the Cyber Resilience Act. So this is a legislation that tries to improve security of electronic devices and services, including IoT. And one of the problems there was that more or less it would create enormous challenges for open source development. Because people who contributed this would be liable for things that go wrong there while they don't get payment. So that was a letter that actually had some effect. For CSAM, you'll hear more about Jaap-Henk, but it's not clear. And then there was also the IDAS regulation. That was the third legal battle we had. And so I'll say a few words about that because it's also going to affect everything we do. So in fact, we had already in 1999 electronic signature legislation, and those countries who are good students in the European class, like Belgium, we actually get an electronic identity card in 2003 following this regulation. The Netherlands didn't do it. Germany made an optional one. Estonia is another good student. The Scandinavians built one based on their financial infrastructure. So the Commission was very unhappy with this because, of course, Belgium had a card, Estonia had a card, but as a Belgian, if you go to Estonia, good luck, it wouldn't work, right? Or vice versa, there was no interoperability. So it was also a directive. So the Commission decided to make a regulation, 2014, regulating signatures, seals, which are signatures by companies, timestamps, registered delivery, and then QUACs, qualified website authentication. I'll come back to those. And then also they looked at historical archiving and long-term validation. Again, it was not a big success. It was only public sector. Private sector had no pickup except for countries like Belgium or Estonia, where you have a mandatory card and sometimes the private sector picks it up. Few providers. In Belgium, for example, you got It's Me, which is an app that does something similar as EID. Inflexible, in most cases, not cross-border. So if you shop with your It's the Netherlands, you can't do anything, and vice versa. If you come up with a German app or a German card to Belgium, we can't read it. Well, there is ways to bypass it, but they're kind of tedious and complex. So the Commission got inspired, I'm afraid, by contact tracing apps. They saw how a number of highly motivated academics without any money in a couple of months can create an app and get to 100 million users. Of course, there was some government support and there was subsidies, but in general, it was for the Commission, I think, baffling that, look at this, there is a pandemic, and now in less than 6 months, we have an app used by 100 million users. In a year, it was even better because, of course, you could only travel to your vacation destination if you had such an app showing, well, not all apps show these things, but there was a second application, was these vaccination certificates, again, was apps in most countries. So the Commission said, hey, we're going to do this too. In 2 years, we're going to make an identity app for Europe. That's what happens. People in the Commission see these things. I told them they're crazy, but of course they don't listen to academics. So they went ahead anyway. So they still want to regulate also QUACs. I'll come back to this. So website certificates. So but their vision is a mobile identity wallet with government-issued identities. And so it's plural. So they're very ambitious. It's not only your identity card, but also your driver's license, your health insurance, your work permit. Plus, it should be open to private sector as well. They want also private sector to get applications in there. So more or less Europe thought like, look, what we did in the pandemic, we're going to do this even better, even larger scale, and finally solve the interoperability problem. They even included blockchain in there, but that's just because it was 2020 or 21, right? They had to do that. There is no blockchain in there for sure, but it's in the document. And so they also paid attention, so there is actually selective disclosure of attributes. So there is some privacy issues there because they kind of understood that this may have actually some privacy concerns. So actually, 11 days ago, the Belgian presidency was happy to announce that regulation had been completed. The work will be available by 2026, so it took actually 5 years, not 2. It will be voluntary. The NGO sees it as a big victory that people who refuse to use it will not be forced to do it. Of course, I don't know whether it will be Belgian form of voluntary. So in Belgium, if you ever click on something where they send you something, then they assume that from now on everything will be digital. So some people now have unpaid traffic fines because they once accepted something for their taxes, and now they actually get the traffic fines in the same system, and they don't know about it. But okay, so that's, I hope it's not that kind of voluntary, that if you once click that actually that means you do it forever. And so also the quacks, but we'll come back to those as well. There's good things. They now will be at EU level, and so they actually now figured out that they have to have standards, so there is an architecture reference framework being developed, and they even make it public, although of course only with a very large delay. The current version is completely outdated. It's going to be open source. Wow. And there is a privacy focus, no unique identifier. We will preclude tracking, profiling, and discrimination. And if you want to use the app, you will be registered, so you cannot, not anybody can start collecting data using the app as a service provider. That's the good. There is also bad. Well, it's not really. Member states, the open source member states are granted leeway so that for justified reasons, specific components other than those installed on user devices need not be disclosed. So in fact, you can't see the server side, so you don't know what the server is doing. Right? This is so much about open source. So there is actually probably tracking at the server happening. Again, would not allow to obtain data logs for tracking. This is good. But then actually, if you look at the detailed text, the final text, it actually says that unlinkability and observability is optional. The member state can decide. So there is big words, but in the fine print, actually, and the legal text, it says it's optional. And this reference framework is not up to date. The version that's public still is version 1.0. I know that there is a version 2 circulating and that there is some meetings being planned, but sorry, whatever. Yeah. But in any case, it's not, we still don't have an up-to-date version there. What's public is way behind what is there. And more or less, the position is that anonymous credentials is too innovative. We can't do this. So forget that Europe has spent for 20 years ago tens of millions of euros on these things. The argument is it's not in Bouncy Castle, so we can't use it. They can spend tens of millions of euros, but they can't spend $1 million or $500,000 on making a library that implements anonymous credentials. So ugly part, the impact on Web PKI. I guess you all know how Web PKI works. So if you get a browser, you get in there 660 CAs, apparently owned by something like 70 companies. And if you trust a certificate sent to you by a web server to your browser, you more or less trust in this depend on trusting the union of all these CAs. So you hope that none of them are corrupt. And of course, we know that some of them are corrupt because they have been caught, which is a bit of a problem. And of course, we also know that many CAs never check anything. So the most famous incident was the VeriSign Microsoft incident 2001. In 2003, I think, what happened was that somebody got some fake Microsoft certificates, Microsoft developer certificates, and VeriSign never bothered to check who they gave it to. And then Microsoft tried to revoke certificates, but it turns out that at that moment their browser have revocation implemented. So that's more or less how Web PKI was. And I guess in the Netherlands I can just mention DigiNotar, and we all know what we're talking about. There is some problems. So ADAS 2 pushes these quacks further. So more or less Europe wants to regulate the CA industry, which by itself doesn't seem to be so bad. And so you have to show their legal identity in a user-friendly way. Now, this was tried before, because in 2008 we got extended validation, where web servers, or the CA said, if you're going to pay a lot of money, we're going to actually do what we always promised to do but never did. We're going to check the identities of the companies, and we'll actually then make it very secure by having a green bar in the browser. That was tried, and after 8 years it was abandoned, because it doesn't work. It was found out that the most corrupt websites have actually a green bar in the browser, and the legitimate ones often don't. It's impossible for a consumer to find out, like many companies have 4 or 5 legal entities in Europe, which ones are the real ones and which not. Probably takes you a day of research to find out. So researchers try to make their point, and they register the company with the name Identity Verified. And you can get a quacks for this. So it just doesn't work. But of course, we saw this on a slide before. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. That's the contribution of Europe. The second one, and I'll skip the details, but you'll get the slides. More or less, the main message is that several European trust service providers tried to be recognized by the Mozilla or Google process and failed, and then didn't do anything. So they can't even do basic due diligence. They fail, and then they just abandon, because anyway, the European regulations that you have to put them in the browser. So Article 45 more or less says that if Europe says this is a qualified trust service provider, you have to put their quacks in your browser and you have to all trust it. Okay. Of course, this opens the door for member states to attack users by giving them fake certificates. And the quacks that issued, you have to trust them, and more or less, this is state-sponsored interception of TLS would be facilitated by this. And then also the regulation actually, if you read it carefully, it forbids browsers to do extra checks, like, for example, certificate transparency. If you want to do extra checks, they have to be allowed by ETSI standards. Did we hear ETSI before today? ETSI is good, right? We can trust them. Okay. So many people got upset. We wrote an open letter, and more or less they said we can't change the text anymore. We're going to change the recital, which tells you how to interpret the text. And so it's like, oh, we're not going to do bad things. That's more or less the summary, what's on the slide. Like, yeah, we know, but and you can do things, you can do extra checks, and it's actually okay. Limit your freedom. If you talk to lawyers, some say yes, this recital is very important because it says how you should read the main body. Some other lawyer says, well, whatever recital is recital, the main body counts. And so it's unclear, so the courts will have to decide. We protested against this, and more or less, also there is a process. Again, this depends how much you trust processes. So if as browser vendor you detect some problem, like a member state issuing fake certificates, you can file a complaint, or you can suspend the certificate, and then it's a dispute by the supervisory authority, notified in the commission, and then a decision is made. The decision can also be that you have to keep the certificate anyway, based on national security. And some people think that this is going to work because the commission is watching. I'm not so sure. And then I'll skip the details, but it was a very long and tedious process. What you should remember is that most of these changes were introduced in the trilogue over the summer, in a very technical discussion. And then there were many big discussions. And in the end, the vote in the parliament only passed because the commission promised there would become a statement from the council, the member states, the parliament and the commission saying, we're not going to do bad things. We're not going to track people, and we're not going to issue fake certificates. And then the thing was voted, and then, so the big news, and then the commission said, no, the council is not going to approve it. The commission will make a statement with the parliament that we're not going to do bad things. But the member states actually don't want to commit to a letter to say they're not going to do bad things, which makes me very suspicious. If you're not going to do bad things, why don't you commit to this? And so one thing is saying we're not going to issue fake certificates, or we let browsers check for fake certificates. And the other one statement, these statements are public, is we're not going to track you. Except, of course, what is necessary in order to ensure the continuity in the provision of what services or to protect users from disruptions in their provision. So if they feel that they should track you to protect their services, then they can track you. So my summary is there will be tracking. And this is one app being used by all member states for tracking your public interaction and your private interaction. Right? The model is the one place where you interact with everything, and this is the best you can do. No guarantee from the member states, and this kind of half-baked guarantee from the Commission. So I think eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. So there is a lot of work for researchers to keep watching what is going to happen, because I forgot to make this clear. There is not one app, there are going to be 27 apps. Every member state will have their own app, have their own ways to read the rules and implement the rules. Okay, so I'll stop here and you can read the conclusions if you want. Thank you for your attention.
Jaap-Henk is Associate Professor of Privacy Enhancing Protocols and Privacy by Design at Radboud University Nijmegen. He is also a guest professor at Karlstad University in Sweden. And he is associate professor at the law department of the University of Groningen, so we get 3 professors for 1 prize. And he's the principal scientist of the Privacy and Identity Lab, so looks like a perfect speaker in our conference. So he was worried a little bit that Patrick Breyer already told much of what he's going to do, but it turns out that actually that is probably sort of okay, going a bit more in depth on some things. It's on CSAM, and actually that means, could a snitch analyze our messages? That's what it means. Jaap-Henk.
Ben, I don't need it. No. Oh, no, you I don't need it. You. Okay, so thanks for the invitation. Thanks for having all 3 of us. And Bart mentioned that the difficult job of the presenter after lunch is to, be engaging after lunch, and then he gave me the even more daunting task of being engaging after the presentation of Bart, because I enjoyed it very much. So let's see if I can come close to that. Like I said, like Ben has said, I was a bit worried that Patrick did already talk a lot about the client-side scanning CSAM proposal, but then Bart convinced me that he didn't, and I came in later, so I didn't see what he was talking about in the beginning. So I decided to still talk about this, because I have been involved in this discussion for quite some bit, and I think it's important to discuss the things that are happening, and also because that really ties with the theme of this conference, and also as a concrete example of the crypto wars that are still raging in the world. What are we talking about? We're talking about this proposal for regulation of the European Parliament to combat child sexual abuse. And that means specifically combating any material that visually depicts child engaging in real or simulated sexual explicit conduct, etc., etc. So this is a definition taken from the directive already from 2011, and that is not only the standard thing of what we think of like child pornography as pictures, but it could also be generated pictures, anything that is related to that. So that is already the topic of what we're talking about, is this kind of material, which of course is very, very, let's say, horrible kind of content related to horrible cases of abuse. And it's of course very logical that we as a society want to combat that, but then the question is, how do we do that in a sensible, reasonable, and also workable way? And this is what the regulation tries, at least in the intent to achieve. Whether it actually achieves the goal, I beg to differ, I guess, but that's at least the clear intention. Bart already mentioned that there is, at the moment, a temporary derogation to scan for this kind of material on, for instance, cloud storage. If you have the possibility to look at the content that people upload, you are, by means of derogation that is extended to 2026, allowed to scan for these images for the possible inclusion of this CSAM material. But the Commission wanted to go further and wanted to actually impose a requirement to go for this scanning of this kind of material. So this is what this regulation is all about. And the scope is both on hosting providers that are hosting this kind of content, and on the providers of so-called interpersonal communication services. Again, something they find in another European directive from 2018, which includes services where this is only a minor ancillary feature. So even if interpersonal communication is not the main part of the service that you provide, but it is something that you provide as part of a larger service, you are potentially in scope of this regulation. And by the nature of what an interpersonal communication service means, this is things like WhatsApp, but also Zoom, or even email. So that's the scope. So this is quite big scope. Then what is the rough structure of this regulation? It basically says that any of these services, any of the entities in scope offering services in Europe have to do a risk assessment, have to analyze the risk of whether their service is being used for the distribution of CSAM. And depending on the risk assessment, they have to do and take certain mitigation measures. For instance, do content moderation, if they see the content. Or do things like age verification or age assessment in other means. They also have to report about the outcome of the risk assessment to the national competent authority. And then it's up to the national competent authority to decide whether additional measures are necessary. And there's two types of measures that can be taken. One, and I will not talk about that, but I want to mention that that's the so-called blocking orders, which means that the national authority can actually issue orders to internet access services, hosting services, access services, to block certain content based on URLs. Interestingly enough, in the Netherlands, there is a current proposal under proposed, which also might put the internet access service providers, so internet service providers, may require them to block certain DNS queries. So and this is something that is against by the Society of Internet Service Providers, because they think that is overly broad kind of blocking that will take place. But like I said, I'm not going to talk about that much in this presentation, not at all, beyond this. I want to talk about this other thing that the national authorities can actually impose, and this is so-called detection order. So if, according to the risk assessment and according to the national authority, the risk that the service is being used for the distribution of CSAM is high, then a so-called detection order can be issued to the provider of that service. And in the text of the regulation, it says that in case of significant risk, such a detection order has to be can be issued, and that it can, and that in that case it will outweigh the breach of fundamental rights, which are obvious because the detection order means that the service provider will have to scan all messages being sent for the potential inclusion of CSAM. Now, what can the detection order the service provider to do? Three different things. Detection of known material, known CSAM, detection of not yet known, so-called unknown CSAM, and thirdly, the solicitation of children, grooming. So this is not only about images, but also about checking text messages for potential cases of grooming. This is why, for instance, Patrick Breyer consistently calls this proposal the chat control proposal, because it's broader than just images, it's also text. Now, the idea of the detection order is that the detection order is given to a provider of a service for no longer than 24 months. So if you get a detection order issued, it should be in place for no longer than 24 months, but then of course it can be, I guess, extended. And it's supposedly targeted and limited, but it's very unclear what that means. It is said in the regulation that it's supposed to be targeted and limited, but to all, as far as I can tell, or we can tell, because like Bart mentioned, several people, including Bart, and others have been up in arms about this proposal as well. We don't see a lot of targetedness in the proposal so far. And the detection orders have to be detect material based on indicators and technology that is provided by a special European center for this purpose, which actually is going to be hosted next to Europol, interestingly enough. So what kind of indicators are we talking about? Indicators are images or URLs, and the images and URLs by this new center and can be submitted by the national authorities. And what should happen with the detection order the messages being sent will be scanned based on these indicators. And if any message matches the indicator, then a report has to be filed to this EU center. Now, you as a user getting reported to the center will not be immediately notified of this taking place. This will only happen after at most 3 months or earlier if it's manifestly clear that nothing bad has happened. Anything that is not manifestly unfounded is forwarded to law enforcement. So there's a first check taking place at the center, and anything that is not manifestly unfounded, that's to say, anything that is clearly not CSAM, anything that is not clearly not CSAM, is forwarded to law enforcement. Europol has access to the report database. There is no strict retention limit on these reports, and all reports, including the manifestly unfounded ones, are kept. So this is the legal part. That's the idea. Now, the elephant in the room, why this becomes interesting, is of course end-to-end encryption. Because with end-to-end encryption, if I send a funny cat, then I know I'm sending a funny cat. The recipient of that image will see a funny cat, but the service provider in the middle only sees ciphertext. Nothing that can be used for anything that implements a detection order. Now, Bart also mentioned that the European Commission, at least publicly, and several governments, including the Dutch government, have always publicly claimed that they want and are supporters of end-to-end encryption. So the regulation does not say that you have to break encryption. You have to do something else in order to do and implement the detection order. What can you do to do the detection order if you have the elephant in the room, namely end-to-end encryption, and that is client-side scanning. And actually the term client-side scanning in itself does not appear in the regulation. It's just one form of implementing the detection order that could work in the case of end-to-end encryption. And what happens there is that if I am sending this cute picture of this cat on my phone, there is a process taking place that has to take place because of the detection order. Check if that picture is CSAM or not. And if it's CSAM, then there's going to go a report to the agency. If it's not, then the picture is being sent. That is the idea of client-side scanning. And the idea is that so the detection order is put on a service provider of a communication service, and that means that the app of the communication service, so WhatsApp, Zoom, Signal, will have to have this client-side scanning code running inside the app. And like I said, there's basically 3 different types of CSAM being targeted by the regulation. The first one is this known CSAM, the second one is this unknown CSAM, and the third one is its grooming. And there's basically different techniques being proposed to detect these different kind of CSAM. And they all have their certain properties that I want to talk about, especially about the known CSAM, but also a little bit about the AI part. And so for known CSAM, there's a method called perceptual hashing that I will talk about later, which has a very, very low probability of flagging an innocent cat picture or any other picture as CSAM. So there's a very small, I think, negligible risk of false positives. But for the other 2 groups, for the things like unknown CSAM, and also for detecting grooming, there are no clear indicators of what is unknown CSAM or what is grooming. So this has to be AI-based, machine learning-based technology. And there, the problem is that there's a significant risk of false positives. And in the case of grooming especially, there has to be some form of age verification taking place because, grooming only takes place if one of the people communicating is a malware and the other is not. Now, with these AI-based techniques, so detect unknown CSAM, the problem is that there is a small, but definitely not ignorable, probability of a false accept. So meaning that there's a very small probability that an innocent picture is being flagged as CSAM. And let's say, for sake of argument, that this probability is 0.1%, which is low, really low. That's, I would say, not even achieved with current technology. But this is hard to say, because actually all the technology proposed for detecting CSAM is proprietary, so we have no real way of verifying this. But based on public statements from a company like the main providers of this technology, this seems to be a very good estimate or an overestimate of the capabilities of the technology. Now, if you consider that WhatsApp is sending 130 billion messages a day, and let's say that one of 100 contains an image and is tested, that would still mean, with this false accept ratio, 1.4 million false messages, false positives each day that would enter the center. And that could, for instance, include pictures of, your grandfather taking pictures of the grandchildren playing in the pool, a concerned parent taking pictures of his or her child, sending that to the doctor, because they could conceptually be close to CSAM, so maybe the image classifier will classify them as such. So these people will be reported. They will not know that they will be reported, but they will be reported. That's part of the problem. The other problem, of course, is that given the sheer volume of reports going to the agency, that agency will be overwhelmed. Now, for grooming, it's even more complicated because that's even more contextual. Like, what is grooming? Like I said, it means you have to do age verification in order to even detect grooming. So this kind of like, and I will come back to the issue of practicality of the whole proposal, means that especially the AI-based techniques are relatively easy to disqualify as being useful, sensible, and proportional. But also that I will talk about later. What interests me most is maybe focus a little bit more about detecting the known CSAM based on perceptual hashing. Also because, at least in the Netherlands, the Dutch government is of the opinion that AI-based techniques for detecting CSAM are out of bounds, but they are definitely in favor of having a system for client-side scanning based on known CSAM, based on fingerprinting, being implemented. So what is the idea here? Perceptual hashing is a function that is mapping an image to a short fingerprint in such a way that it's one way. You cannot actually get the image out of the fingerprint, but also that there is a kind of like perceptual equality measure on these fingerprints, in the sense that if you put the same or almost the same picture in the perceptual hashing, then the outcome will be the same hash. Actually, but I'm simplifying here, the outcome will be a hash that has a certain Euclidean distance close to the other image, but that's for all practice that they are equal. So if the two images that you put in match to the same hash function, match to the same fingerprint, then they are roughly the same image. There are several products out there, PhotoDNA, PDQ, Neural Hash. They're all proprietary, so we do not officially know how they work, but they have been reverse engineered. At some point in 2021, this was a few years before the proposal from the commission came out, Apple already toyed with this idea of like, maybe we could do detecting CSAM on the user devices in a privacy-friendly way. So no worries, we can do it in a nice way. They called it the Apple PSI system. And I just want to briefly mention it because it's from a cryptographic point of view, it's an interesting exercise, a problem to study. And we see several more or less well-known cryptographers on this author list. And the idea from a cryptographic point of view is to devise a protocol where essentially you do private set intersection against the images that you as a user have, and the EU agency or whatever organization has with the fingerprints of the known CSAM. Now, there are some complicating measures, factors that make this problem more interesting from a cryptographic point of view. One of them is, of course, that you want to do a threshold, at least in the case of Apple, they wanted to do a threshold kind of thing, like, okay, kind of like 4 strikes and you're out, like thing like, okay, 1 image is not 2 images, but if it's 3, then it's a duck, well, then it's CSAM, and then we're going to report. The most, and of course, and this is something that we have to, that they have to keep in mind, you have to do local matching, and that has to do with the fact that the fingerprints are actually, and of course the CSAM material itself is very, very sensitive, but even the fingerprints are sensitive and secret. So the matching takes place locally to avoid any kind of like leaking in the network traffic, and also to keep network traffic low. So you want to do the matching locally, but you want to do it on blinded copies of the database. So the phones, in the case of client-side scanning, will not have a copy of the fingerprints that you match against, but only a blinded copy. And that has several consequences that we will see. So there's general issues with detecting known CSAM. Client-side scanning has to be implemented on all the phones, or at least has to be embedded in the code of every messenger that has given detection order. That means that it is not targeted limited. It's there and it's running. You could maybe activate it remotely or not, but you activate it for everybody or nobody, because the detection order itself is not targeted to any specific people. Secondly, the system is totally opaque. The hashing algorithms are proprietary, though some are reverse engineered. Even fingerprints of known CSAM are secret. So that means that independent verification of what is being scanned on the phone is totally impossible. You have blinded fingerprints of something that you don't know, so you don't know what's being detected. And basically, service providers have to trust what is given to them. They are basically given a database of blinded fingerprints, and it says, that's it, that's it. But there's more. Even with the specifics of perceptual hashing, there's problems. One of the problems is that it's easy to evade. For certain known methods of perceptual hashing, rotating the image, for instance, creates a totally different fingerprint and therefore no longer matches. Okay. The other thing, which is even more interesting, is that actually it is possible to create false positives. Very nice paper by Prokop and others from 1 year ago shows that you, given an image of a shark, you can create an image of an innocent boy, perturb the image a little bit, and make sure that the fingerprint of that image actually matches the fingerprint of the shark. And this is the example actually from the paper. What does it mean? Well, there is the risk of function creep in general. Because of the fact that there's no independent oversight, we don't see the fingerprint, we don't see the images. Anything could be added to the database, anything could be created fingerprints of, could be submitted to the service providers, and then this could be used as input for scanning. And then not only CSAM, but things like terrorist imagery, anti-Semitic imagery, whatever, any kind of like content that is not liked could be flagged and reported to the agency. This could, of course, be prevented in a certain way with proper oversight, but I mean, I'm not sure how much prevention actually will take place there. What is worse is that actually, given the techniques that I just showed you, the problems with this perceptual hashing, things like surreptitious function creep are also possible, where you taint the database with the images, with the CSAM material, with images that you generate that look like CSAM, so there are all the reasons to be in the database, But you create those images in such a way that they actually match the fingerprint of material that you want to detect, which could be any other material. Now, an independent body overseeing the database sees CSAM, but if you run the system will actually detect other material. There's also other problems. People can be falsely reported. If I happen to know the fingerprint of one piece of CSAM in the database, I can, using the techniques of Procos, create a funny cat picture, modify it a little bit such that the fingerprint matches the fingerprint in the database, send it to Ben or to Bart, and they like funny cat pictures, so they want to share it with each other, and therefore these guys get, Bart shakes, he never forwards funny cat pictures. Okay, good to know. But you would, see, there you go. You would be reported. The other attack would be that a group of activists somehow obtain this fingerprint and decide to create funny cat pictures matching this fingerprint and massively share it with each other, creating a flood of false positives reports to the agency. And this would clog the pipeline. Now, on this pipeline, this is not an ordinary, simple thing. Like, we already know that moderation of social networks is a horrible job. It's very stressful, psychologically demanding. Here we're talking about the worst of the worst of the worst of the possible filth that you can look at. So, this is a very tightly secured pipeline with very specially trained personnel, and already now, current law enforcement capacity is not big enough to deal with current reports of CSAM that are happening. So that is already a problem. There's more fundamental objections. We have to realize that end-to-end encryption is a means to an end. And that client-side scanning breaks confidentiality of correspondence, and that the essence of the law of privacy of correspondence is that you can be sure nobody is looking at what you are corresponding. Whereas CSS basically creates a snitch that looks at every message that we send before we put it in a digital envelope and send it out. I would argue that our smartphone is our digital home. We carry it with us all the time. We share all our intimate correspondence, anything with it. And therefore it should have similar protection as the traditional home. But client-side scanning creates the first law enforcement foothold inside this. Inside our digital home. Looking at least partially to some of the things that we do all the time on our phone. And to get into this analogy of the digital home, there's other kinds of crimes that we think are very bad. Think about domestic violence. We could think of ways to fighting domestic violence by, for instance, installing a webcam in every home. It is off, but that automatically switches on if domestic violence is detected, and then a live feed of what is happening is sent to law enforcement. We would not be okay with that, but this is in essence what client-side scanning is proposing. We have mandatory age verification. This is problematic already specifically for access to communication services, but it also shows the negative aspects of the thing that Bart already talked about, the EIDAS proposal for digital identity in Europe that's being usable for not only public but also private services, because it opens the door for the verification of all kinds of like personal attributes, like age, like health, like we saw in the Corona period, before we get access. So that means that a much tighter form of access and control is being made possible, and this is just one of the examples. even more fundamentally, I would say that the whole proposal is fighting the symptoms instead of the actual abuse, the actual thing that is bad, because most of the material that's going to be detected is going to be material that is like ages old. It's old material. It's being recirculated, recirculated. Nothing is being done about abuse itself. And I'm really worried about the fact that unfounded reports are kept. Also, because, the no smoke without fire, like if I'm being reported several times, even though every time it's an innocent picture, maybe somebody might think that it's worth to have a chat with me. There's an independent report by Ott van Dalen from IVER from a year ago about the fundamental rights assessment, about specifically the detection orders. The main point, the main takeaway here is that, and Bart already mentioned that also in his presentation, we have had several similar cases of mass indiscriminate surveillance in the past in Europe, the Data Retention Directive. They were struck by the Court of Justice of the EU, and it's the opinion of Ott van Dalen, a legal scholar, but also other legal scholars, that if the proposal would get through and would actually be challenged in court, then in the end at the Court of Justice, a similar decision will have to be made, because the detection orders affect the rights to privacy. But any thing that happens and that is being decided, or any measure that's being taken, must always respect the essence of the right to privacy enshrined in the Charter. And actually, in the case of data retention, the court has said that indiscriminate analysis of confidential communications affects the essence of these rights, and therefore, because the detection orders are aimed at services, not individual people, they can hardly be called proportionate. To conclude, I have a less impressive time slide than Bart has, but this is the timeline for the current proposals. The proposal was published in 2022. In 2023, in the Netherlands, we had the motion van Ginneken urging the cabinet to oppose the proposal and to fight for the right to end-to-end encryption. The cabinet decided to put that motion aside, and therefore the official position of the Dutch government is still that they are in favor of the regulation for as long as it is only limited to detecting known CSAM. You heard Patrick talk this morning about his position on this file and the fact that the European Parliament came with a totally different counter proposal. That hasn't really steered the ship to a different course, given the fact that we now have a new proposal by the EU in March. We, as scientists, wrote in 2023 an open letter, and then in 2024 another open letter. And I just learned that there's fears that there's a new proposal by the European. By Europe, where the idea is that the detection of CSAM and client-side scanning will actually be implemented for all kinds of material, but you as a user have a choice. You either accept the client-side scanning and then you can use messaging, or you don't, and you don't use messaging. And that is apparently a compromise text that is now being put in front of the member states, and it appears that this is a kind of compromise that's winning over more member states, so it might actually be the case that this proposal gets accepted. We hope not. Let us see. And this on the other side is an interesting report by Bart Preneel together with a few other investigative journalists, who showed that Thorn, this company that I briefly mentioned during the presentation, has had a very strong influence on the development of this proposal, mainly because they will be the main seller of the technology being used to do the detection. And that is, I think, worrying from another, for different reasons, namely that, and this is again not something new, but still, Apparently the Commission wants to listen to companies like Thorn, but refuses to listen to people like Bart and me and many others. Thank you for your attention. I don't know if we have time for questions, but if we do.
Thank you, Jaap-Henk. I think we have 7-8 minutes or so for questions. So there's already one. Yes, please. It works.
No, two questions. The question is this was the first question. You want three?
So the first one is, you mentioned at the beginning that company has to do a risk assessment, but with this risk assessment, then what are the parameter, what is really in this? And the second is, you mentioned that there is more visible risk of uncertainty of the situation, but I'm aware of other company or entity than the function provider that's similar.
Let me start with the last question. That's a good point. The figure the very, very low risk of false positives for perceptual hashing actually come from the companies providing that technology. So that, as far as I know, has not been independently verified. Similar figures for different kind of technologies have been reported. We can argue whether that is trustworthy or not. With respect to the first question, it's entirely unclear to me how that risk assessment will take place. As far as I understand, the risk assessment will take place by the companies themselves. But of course, the national authorities will have something to say about that, because if every company says like, hey, look, there's nothing happening, then at some point the national authorities will say like, hey, that's weird because we have regulation, we think there's something happening. Maybe Bart knows more about this, but Bart.
Maybe I can add that. So essentially, not the EU proposal is now in the Belgian presidency.
Yeah, true.
The Commission is kind of watching,
yeah,
right? The Parliament is really, or the current Parliament is now standing on one side, the Council and the Member States pushing it.
Yeah.
So the latest drafts have very long appendages on what is high risk, right? It will be related to yourself. And of course, these are the critical things that will be massaging the latter. For example, if you don't have too much in your name, all the services is high risk, and when it's high risk, so there is more or less, I think what we could make up from the document is that everything like WhatsApp, Signal will only have high risk. Everything with large number of users and the description will be high risk, so we'll have to do the scanning.
Okay.
Okay. Next question. Yes, please.
Hi, I was wondering, the lawmakers, they seem to fall into the same trap over and over again. They seem to make the same mistakes. There doesn't seem to be any capacity to learn from previous strikes in the crypto war. Assuming that these people aren't stupid, which is a stretch, what can you speculate about what the real goal is here?
I don't know what the real goal is here, but I do sympathize with their predicament. And the problem is that the digital domain really works different from the older physical domain that we all come from. And we, as computer scientists, maybe understand the digital domain slightly better than these people working at the Commission, but these guys are typically not stupid, I would say, far from it. But the thing is that for all these digital technologies, you have a kind of like all or nothing kind of like thing happening. Either you have full control or you have nothing. And both are very undesirable. The problem is that from a criminal perspective, you also have the same kind of like massive increase of scale as soon as you go digital. And you will know this from your work, from the hacking perspective, it's the same, right? So I understand that as a government, you see things evolving in the digital sphere almost without limit. Now we can argue whether this is actually happening in the case of CSAM on, for instance, messaging apps. There's a big discussion on whether this is actually happening there and whether you should not go after, say, the hosting providers when the actual data is stored. Or we can argue about should we fight the abuse or should we fight the images of the abuse? I mean, these are different kind of things, but in a very general sense, I understand the struggle that if you see something happening in the digital domain without any limits to scalability, what are you supposed to do as law enforcement or as governments in general to somehow mitigate this? That is, I think, the general point where they find themselves. And that's but as far as like the goal, I don't know. Like it also depends. Like Bart said, you could also, and I think I'm on Bart's camp here. Like there's so much more data and so much more metadata available to law enforcement compared to 20, 30 years ago. That the law enforcement has it's much easier to do stuff than 20, 30 years ago.
Now, respond? Yeah, so I'm asking you a quick question because like exactly what you said, like there's plenty of opportunity doing forensics and stuff. Those responsibilities haven't become less in my view. So why is there always this desire for doing it on a massive scale? And exactly the thing that you point out, it's very impractical if you want to use this for criminal So I guess like all the arguments, I haven't heard a counter argument for like that makes sense to me, or like someone who basically counteracts your arguments that in a way that's persuasive to me. And the same goes for Bart. Like, okay, there seems to be a pattern here. There's a good argument on the side. They get discarded. They get like people like you don't get asked for their opinion anymore.
Not anymore. Not anymore. Not. It's not because I'm playing in the ass, I guess.
What could be the mechanism behind the scenes? I just don't see why you keep on trying over and over again, and each time we end up with the same results.
Bart, do you want to be more cynical than me? I think you might. I mean, I don't know. I mean, it could just be very simply be we want access, period, no matter what. We were used to having access in the old days, and we want to keep access. And we don't know how to do it other way, in any other way.
Is it not simply a matter of that they then can show that they did everything they could?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, that was at least the impression. Yeah. No, I mean this might be security theater for partly. Yeah, sure. And of course, there's a big lobby behind it. Thorn is trying to sell something here.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to the coffee break.
Yes.